We've discussed using flash for indoor and outdoor portraiture, and briefly talked about how ambient light plays a role in the overall lighting of our images, both in the background and as fill and main light. What we haven't addressed are the differences between light sources and how those differences can affect our images. Working with different types of light, for example, flash together with household incandescent or tungsten lights, creates a mixed lighting situation. And when you mix these different types of light, you can get unwanted color casts in your pictures, or unexpected results due to differences in constant versus flash lighting duration within the exposure. Now I'm going to break this down and talk about each of these mixed lighting issues in more detail. Light is light, as they say, but different lights can produce drastically different colors in our images, even if they appear to be producing the same colors to our eyes. If the eventual output of your images is black and white, or for whatever reason the color casts don't matter, or if you're using them to produce a special effect, then there's no problem. Otherwise, you might get a difficult to deal with mix of white and orange light, and this can create a lot of extra work for you on the back end if you need to selectively fix these issues on every image in a set of portraits. If you'll take a look at the Kelvin scale, you can see where different types of lighting produce different colors. Tungsten lighting, like you'd find in traditional household light bulbs, is often more orange than flash lighting, which is closer to daylight on the spectrum. Now keep in mind that the color of any original light source can still be affected by anything between the light and the scene. For example, outdoor lighting can be very blue at times, like on overcast days, or very warm in tone, like during sunset. And we can easily compensate for the overall color cast produced by certain types of light using our white balance setting in our cameras, or adjusting white balance later in the process. You can easily make white balance adjustments if you shoot in RAW format and adjust in a RAW converter. Lightroom lets you do this easily. But with mixed lighting, we can run into issues. It's much harder to fix color cast in our images when more than one type of color cast is affecting the picture. For example, if you're using flash for your subject in an environment where there's a lot of ambient tungsten, if your white balance is dialed in for flash, the visible tungsten lighting is going to show up as a distinct orange cast in part of the image. And sometimes this is okay if the differences in color are happening in different parts of the scene. But if your subject is getting both white light and orange light, it can look really odd. For portraiture, there are several solutions to this problem. One way to deal with this: turn off any lighting that would create an unwanted color cast and use only one type of light, in this case flash, for everything in the shot. 2. Use a fast enough shutter speed and overpower the ambient light with flash. In this case, the ambient won't be enough of a factor to affect your image. 3. You can fix color problems in post or alter the color. For example, convert your shots to black and white. And finally, make the color of the light in the scene more uniform. We often do this by placing orange-colored gels over the flash so it produces an orange light similar to tungsten, and use a white balance setting that matches the tungsten. Since all of the light we're using in the scene is now essentially one color, we can correct any color cast easily without having to try to fix different parts of the image separately. Another way mixed lighting can affect our images has to do with the duration of the different types of light sources where our exposures are concerned. Now, with enough exposure time, any constant light is going to record in our image. The longer the shutter is open, the more constant light is going to be recorded. Flash, on the other hand, has a much shorter duration. Usually flash will last only for a fraction of the time the shutter is open. And since it's not constant, it doesn't build up over time, and once the flash fires, its job is done. For example, in a completely dark room, if all you're using is a flash, it doesn't matter if your shutter is set to 1/60th of a second or a full second. When the flash fires during exposure, often just a tiny fraction of the total exposure time, that's all the light you're going to get. And with flash, that's usually plenty. Again, with any constant lighting in the scene, the longer the shutter is open, the more light is going to be recorded. And what's interesting and often very useful is that we can use the effect of different durations of light to our advantage. For example, if we're making a portrait outdoors using flash as the predominant main lighting for our subject, we can make sure to get a proper exposure on her and adjust the shutter speed up or down to affect how much of the background ambient light is recorded in our scene. And we can do this with the exposure compensation control or with the combination of that and the flash exposure compensation control, or more precisely with manual camera and flash settings if we have the time. Remember, the flash we're using to illuminate our subject is not powerful enough to significantly affect something like a landscape or cityscape off in the distance. So the flash isn't how we control the look of the rest of the scene if it's far enough away. We control that with the way the camera meters and records for constant ambient light. The metering and output for the flash is determined separately by you or the camera. Now indoors, it works similarly. The background scene might be a little more affected by flash than an outdoor scene, depending on the size of the room, but the way any constant ambient light shows up is going to be determined by your shutter speed. The slower the shutter speed, the more constant light will show up. Again, the part of your picture being illuminated predominantly by flash isn't going to be affected by shutter speed. One thing to watch out for is unwanted ghosting effects. And this is where ambient light records as movement during exposure. Any movement by the subject will be frozen by the light the flash produces, but if the shutter is open long enough, say in the neighborhood of 1/15 of a second or longer, the constant ambient light will have a chance to illuminate the subject as she or the camera or something else in the scene moves. And that movement will be recorded, and you can get effects like this. So the ways to deal with these issues? If you don't want any constant light streaks, ghosting, or other unwanted motion effects, use a faster shutter speed. Also, if you don't want the dark background effect, but capturing the look of the ambient light in the room isn't necessary, in other words, you don't mind if the room looks different in the photo, just light the subject and background together with a big bounce of uniform room covering light. Finally, if you do want the background to show up in the shots, but you want more control over how it looks, just use your own light sources to get the effect that you want. Otherwise, recording ambient or existing background light in a scene is often a good choice, and it helps add some atmosphere to the portrait. Most of this course has emphasized the use of flash in controlled indoor situations. Indoors, you generally have more control over ambient lighting than you do outdoors, and you don't have to contend with wind and other changing conditions, including lighting, as the sun and clouds make their way across the sky. In this section, I want to talk about flash for outdoor portraiture. And what we've learned about lighting for portraits up to this point still applies, but when it comes to using flash outdoors during daylight hours, the ambient light could be much stronger than anything we'd find indoors. Which brings me to one of the most important points in this section. When you've got good natural light to work with, you often don't need flash at all. As a matter of fact, I prefer not to use flash if it's not necessary, and lots of times I'll rely on the occasional photoreflector instead of using flash. But assuming that flash is being used, it's helpful to know what it's being used for. Outdoors, when natural light is strong, the sun is usually your main light source, and you can think of the clouds and atmosphere as natural main light modifiers, and other surfaces in the environment as lighting reflectors. And these reflectors come in the form of walls, light-colored areas on the ground, and really anything that's going to bounce the sunlight around. So if we're doing a headshot or portrait outdoors, we've already got a lighting setup ready to go. One of the challenges, of course, is that conditions are always changing, and so's the position of your main light, the sun. Since we've got significantly less control over outdoor lighting than we do indoors, we have to make up for it by how we position our subject within the environment. For example, we might bring them into the shade and use reflected ambient light to our advantage, rather than have them stand out under harsh direct sunlight. A photoreflector might be added to pop in a little fill light if our subject's face needs it. Of course, fill light is also something we can accomplish with a flash. And in situations where the ambient lighting is not that strong, or we'd rather overpower the ambient light with flash, we can just dial in the flash power we need to produce our own main light, taking that job away from the sun. So where flash is concerned, it's got one of two jobs outdoors. Either to provide fill lighting, augmenting the ambient light, or to take over as main lighting. In this case, other flash units or the natural light becomes our fill lighting. Of course, flash units can also come in handy for effect. You can use flash to add some rim light or hair light accents to your portrait, and sometimes you can use additional lighting to affect the background. taking environmental conditions into consideration, and wind is something you might need to contend with, you can set up a basic or complete portrait lighting studio outdoors just as you would indoors. So your main light is whatever you determine it to be, as long as it's stronger than the lighting in the environment. The thing is, outdoors, we usually don't want to bring along several lights and stands and modifiers unless we have a few extra hands to help stabilize everything. And if you're changing locations pretty fast or moving around, like with an event where several portraits are going to be taken in unpredictable locations, you're usually better off keeping things simple and using just one flash for most of the pictures. In this case, you can use an on-camera flash setup or a single off-camera flash. If the portraits you're shooting aren't static, in other words, if you and the subject will be moving around, it's probably best to stick with TTL. But you can usually get good results with manual flash and camera settings if you have a static portrait setup. If, however, you're taking full advantage of the natural light and the way it's bouncing around the environment, you'll use your flash as a fill light. Now, the effect you produce with your fill light is up to you, but if you think about the purpose of fill lighting, and just as it is in the studio, the job of fill lighting is to reduce contrast produced by the main light. Another way to look at it, fill light is there to pop in just enough extra light to brighten up the subject's face, keeping the look of the lighting natural. Fill light shouldn't call attention to itself, but again, everyone has a different take on how to apply fill lighting outdoors, so you'll have to find out what looks best to you. If you're using your flash in manual mode, you'll have fine and predictable control of the flash output. But like I said before, that works best if your setup is static and other variables in the environment stay constant. Otherwise, you'll want to take advantage of TTL. And if you're using TTL, you might need to exert a little more control over your flash output on the fly. For this, you can use flash exposure compensation. Here are some examples of how dialing the flash exposure compensation up or down can affect the portrait. Keep in mind that as you bring more light in, you can see the fill light start to take on more of a main light role. Flash exposure compensation is a very handy and powerful tool for outdoor portraiture. So to wrap this section up, take a look at the info posted below this video on how to set up and use your camera and flash for simple outdoor portraiture. We've talked about this before, but I think the topic is important enough to give it its own section. One of the most important things you can do to be successful is find something that works and use it often. To be a successful portrait photographer, you have to know how to reliably and consistently create the looks that your customers expect from you. You can't start from square one with every shoot. It's better if you've got a methodology that you can count on that always produces good results. This usually means you'll have one or two standard go-to configurations that are fast and easy to set up. The position and distances of your lighting and subject, your camera settings, background placement, everything the same every time. Then adjust to tweak things or break away from the standard setup after you get the shots you absolutely need. And this holds true for any type of lighting setup, including outdoors and on-camera flash. Find the configuration that works for you, one that's always going to get the basic job done, and change things up as needed. That's what I call standardization. This is where you take some time to figure out your default setups and camera settings, break them down into their easiest configurations, and always start with those. This is going to eliminate stress, save you time, and it helps you quickly get down to working with your subject to create the portraits you're both looking for. Now to get started, here are some examples. And remember, these won't necessarily work for you. You're going to have to work out your own based on the gear that you use. But this will give you a good idea as to what standardization looks like. So I think you can see how always starting with your own default setups and camera settings can make life a lot easier, while helping you produce good portraits of consistent quality. And once you get the safe shots down, you'll probably have enough time to move on to more creative portraits. We've covered using flash in controlled studio type setups using simple backgrounds. Lots of times this is what you need when you're doing a basic headshot or standard portrait, but sometimes we'd like to give the viewer a little more information about the subject, provide some context for the story we're trying to tell. And you could do this by including the environment, using it as our backdrop. This might be something directly related to our subject's job or interest. It might be a setting that gives the viewer an idea about where the subject lives or spends a lot of their time, or it might just be the subject's home. So how do we take what we've learned so far in this course and use it to create environmental portraits? Well, where lighting is concerned, we're still dealing with the same techniques we'd use in most traditional portraiture. The only difference is approach. You might want to tailor the lighting to make it look more plausible given the location, but that's not always necessary. An environmental portrait can feature lighting that looks like good photographic lighting without calling too much attention to itself. Now, this is going to be a stylistic choice. Since we're making a deliberate choice to feature the background or environment as part of the portrait, we need to consider the lighting and exposure of the background. And like I've suggested previously, try to remember that background lighting is not the same as lighting for the subject. Generally, you'd set up and test the subject's lighting and exposure first. At this point, your camera settings and subject's lights should be locked in. Then you'd add light to the background and adjust the lighting as needed to work with the rest of the setup and produce the effect you want for the background. Of course, discrete lighting zones aren't always necessary. For example, if you're using very broad lighting or filling an entire room with a big bounce light from a flash, just about everything in the room is going to get equal amounts of light. If that's the look you're going for, there's not much to do in the way of lighting the background separately. But even if you're not lighting the background separately, you can still control the visibility of the background and mood of the portrait by considering the distance from the background to the properly exposed areas of your image. The more distance between your portrait setup and any background areas, the darker that background will become. Of course, your lens, choice of aperture, the distances between camera and subject and background are all going to affect depth of field, which can have a lot to do with creating mood or helping to isolate the subject while still giving hints as to their surroundings. Naturally, the composition and choices of what to include in a scene are going to be as important as any lighting considerations. So think about what you're trying to say or what emotions you're trying to evoke or associate with the subject when composing the portrait. And finally, just as with any craft you're trying to learn, nothing is going to help more than experimenting and just getting out there and doing it.